Welcome everyone to the Sensible Drug Policy Show created by Students for Sensible Drug Policy International. Here, we share insights from young advocates at the forefront of local, national, and international decision-making around drugs. Our network is an active force for reform in more than 30 countries around the world, and it's time you hear them talk. You will hear from policy experts, both current students and alumni, who will share their experience, tips, and insider knowledge about the most recent developments in the field.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Sensible Drug Policy Show, developed by Students for Sensible Drug Policy International. Today we're having another discussion as part of our UN series where we're inviting young advocates in the drug policy space that can share insights on the international drug policy, and how this environment works, because it can be quite an inaccessible environment and quite intimidating when you think of it initially as you're sort of from the outside looking in. We are joined here today by Nazlee and Heath, who are both from Canada and have very interesting experiences to share with us, particularly as member of the Canadian delegation to the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and also of the UNODC Youth Forum, which is one of the main mechanisms that was evolved by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime to involve youth in debates on drug policy and decision-making processes. I'll let them introduce themselves now. Nazlee, would you like to start?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Nazlee. First off, thanks so much to SSDP for having me on this podcast. It's a pleasure to be here. So I guess I'm wearing two of my organizational hats today. One is manager of the Policy Impact Unit at the Center on Drug Policy Evaluation, or CDPE, in Toronto, Canada. And our mission is to support the development of evidence, health, and rights-based drug policies at local, national, and international levels. And we do that through both research and outreach. And my other affiliation that I'll mention is the chair of the New York NGO Committee on Drugs, or the NYNGOC. And that is a substantive committee of the Conference of NGOs in Consultative Relationship with the UN, or Congo. We've been around since 1984, and really our mission is to support civil society in engaging with the UN on drug policy and practice. We have over 100 civil society members, and we're global in scope, but our membership is really focused on the Americas. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nazlee. Heath?
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited. I haven't talked like global drug policy in a while. So yeah, my name is Heath. I use they, them pronouns. I am a youth drug policy activist and advocate for people who use drugs, and particularly young people who use drugs, and the rights of those people through Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy. I served on their board for like 4 or 5 years, and now I'm running their cannabis education campaign, Get Sensible. And I've been very fortunate to represent CSSDP at UNGAS in 2016, which was like my first kind of engagement with global drug policy. And then I was on the Canadian delegation at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in, I believe it was like 2018. I'm trying to remember, CND 63, I think, the High Level Commission on Narcotic Drugs. And I participated in the Youth Forum as well. And I believe I was one of the first young people that Canada sent through the Youth Forum as well. So I'm excited to share a bit of what that looks like from the inside.
Thank you so much. We're really excited to have you and to get some insights from your perspectives and your experiences. I think it's truly amazing to have people that have been there at such historic points in terms of the development of drug policy and civil society involvement and youth involvement in those high-level decision-making processes. I think it will be good. I think I forgot for us to introduce ourselves from SSDP International. So yeah, I think that's also necessary sometimes. You might remember us from previous podcasts. I'm Julia Vatau. That's my name. I am the UN Global Fellow for Students for Sensible Drug Policy International, and I'm joined here by my fabulous co-host that has allowed me to lead this conversation today, Sarah Velimirovich. Sarah, can you introduce yourself? Because despite the fact that we are from neighboring countries, I still don't know how to pronounce her name accurately.
You're doing a great job, Yulia. Thank you. So, hi everyone. My name is Sarah. I'm the development officer for Students for Sensible Drug Policy International, and I'm your co-host today. Super excited to be talking to you two today about the UN and how we can increase the impact of youth voice over there.
Amazing. So let's just get straight into it and just unpack this amazing minds that we have here. Okay, so I guess let's start about having an idea of your experiences. So Heath, I know you said you're part of the youth forum and you're like one of the one of the first young people from Canada that actually went there. Can you tell us more about your experience there and just how did you find that forum? Because I guess it can be quite intimidating when you think about it, and and the youth that come there, I think that can be also intimidating when we sort of try to imagine who actually goes there.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think especially because I had already had some level of like UN engagement through UNGAS, like, and because UNGAS being kind of like an emergency special session was like so disorganized, I was
sorry. What is UNGAS?
So UNGAS was the United Nations General Assembly special session on the world drug problem, which was like a special meeting that happened in New York in 2016. So it was like kind of like this emergency, like we're like reevaluating all of the kind of like, it wasn't a typical CND session. I don't know, Naz, if there's anything that you would add about like how UNGAS differs. It's just kind of like an emergency UN meeting, I guess.
Yeah, it was pushed forward from 2019. So I think it was 3 Latin American presidents demanded an earlier meeting. So 2016 was something that was kind of not on the schedule originally, but was called for by member states.
Yeah. And so having gone to that as like an emergency session, it was like kind of disorganized and like civil society engagement was like not super easy. So I was like, okay, at least at CND, it'll be more organized and let's see what's up with the youth forum. But my attitude was also kind of that like the youth forum was like the kiddie table of the UN, because there's like UN conversations that are happening that youth could just as easily participate in and be a part of. But instead they have the youth forum, which is where they can like put the youth, and often they're happening at the same time. So the youth are all going to this youth forum instead of participating in like the more like actual CND proceedings. But the year that I went, I was fortunate that the youth forum happened before the CND. So I actually got to participate in both. And I was one of the, I think like me and the other Canadian delegate were the only like youth from the forum that actually also got to participate in the like high level, like actual CND. And it was, I believe, like, you know, operated by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. I think it's sponsored by like, I think like Russia is like the country that sponsors it. So they, right at the beginning, it was the year that Canada had legalized cannabis. So like right at the beginning of the youth forum, they're like, some of these countries are, you know, letting, are just like adapting their drug policies in ways that are harming young people. And I'm just like, just trying to be obviously diplomatic and just being like, okay, interesting. They're just straight up calling us out immediately. Welcome to be here. Thank you. This is what it is. And it was like highly structured. The engagement was still like nice. It was like broken up into different sessions over a couple of days to get like young people from all different countries and differing backgrounds and perspectives to share their feedback. I think the overall vibe of a lot of people was like, you know, protecting young people from the scourge of drugs. And my attitude was more so like having a conversation about the way drug policies affect young people. So I feel like I had like a bit of a different perspective. And I also had been working in drug policy prior for like 3 or 4 years. So I had a lot of experience under my belt and was one of the older people at the youth forum, because I think the minimum age is like 13 and the maximum cutoff is like 24. So they were like young youths at this forum as well that were talking about like the impacts of drugs on their communities and things like that. But yeah, and then I guess like the way it culminates is like after talking a lot about like prevention efforts, which is like a big focus, is like talking about drug prevention. We come together, the youth, to formulate a statement. And it's essentially like a statement that is read out before the Commission on Narcotic Drugs on behalf of the youth of the world, essentially. So yeah, and like I felt like that could have maybe been a bit better, but like it was, everyone got to kind of like say their little parts, and I think we managed to get like stigma included and talk a little bit about like harm reduction, and like a lot of the youth there like weren't familiar with these ideas particularly. So it was also just like a fun opportunity to like connect with other youth and share some of that. But yeah, I don't know, that's kind of what I would say about the youth forum. It was pretty like structured. It didn't feel like, it felt like a little like handholdy, a little like limited in like what it offered, honestly. And I feel like I got more out of the external networking that happened through like SSDP and Paradigma events that were happening adjacent and alongside the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. I feel like that was immensely more valuable than the youth forum itself, honestly. But yeah, I don't know, I'll say that. I don't know if you have any other questions or if we should like my little ramble, my youth forum ramble.
Oh yeah, we do love a youth forum ramble, to be honest. And yeah, I totally see your point, Heath. I think from what we have also seen as a civil society organization that hasn't necessarily had access to that forum, but has talked to a lot of delegates that were there. It's just that the space can be quite tokenizing, and it doesn't necessarily have that much of an impact on like the main proceedings of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. But it's still quite interesting because both you, Heath, and Nazlee, you've had you are quite lucky in the sense that the delegation that you work with was kind of helped you get involved with a lot of the processes at the United Nations, not only the youth forum. So we kind of, I guess you were fortunate in the sense that you had a lot of avenues to get your voices heard compared to sort of what other delegations do with the young people that they select for the youth forum, for example. So sort of going on from that, I was kind of interested to know how did your engagement with the Canadian delegation in international drug policy evolve? And I know, Nazlee, I think you can speak on that from sort of a historical point of view quite well. And then I'm also interested in hearing your point, your perspective, Heath.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree that we're fortunate now to have a government that is maybe more receptive to our ideas around drug policy and harm reduction and reform. But that was not always the case. And that was not the case when I started going to the CND, which was back in 2014. And actually at the time, I was the chair of the board of Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy and kind of initiated CSSDP's first engagement in international drug policy at the UN and at the CND. And it was totally a different kind of era of time. And that was, of course, because for the first couple of years in 2014 and 2015 that I was going to the CND, we had a conservative government. And that government really was limited in their engagement with civil society. We were lucky if we got 2 meetings. We usually had one with the government at the CND. We would try and make sure that we had an opportunity to meet with them and share our beliefs, but it was really, I would say, one-sided. There was not a lot of receptiveness from the government. There wasn't much they could say. It was really just a check marking exercise that they did meet with us the one time. So tokenistic, if that word can be used again. But luckily, we did have our continued current Liberal government. They were elected in late 2015. So civil society really seized the opportunity then for increased engagement with the government around UN drug policy issues. And I should say that by civil society, I'm really referring to this kind of ad hoc body, I guess. It's called the Canadian Civil Society Working Group on UN Drug Policy, or just the working group. And we were founded in around prep for that UNGAS meeting that Heath mentioned. That was in 2016. And it's really a diverse group of national organizations that focus on drugs in different ways. And the goal is to provide input to Canada on drug policy issues at the UN. So the government was receptive in 2015. And that example that he gave about the UNGAS delegation, that was kind of our first inroads with getting civil society on the CANDEL, the abbreviated term for Canadian delegation. And our engagement has really continued to grow since then. I mean, I think the next kind of marked improvement was in 2018. Civil society organizations, we were given the opportunity by the Canadian government to elect our own representative, a role called the civil society liaison, which has continued since on the Canadian government delegation. And it's really like a point person for communicating and bridging knowledge gaps between the government and civil society. And it's also both in the lead up, during, and after the CND as well. So it's kind of a year-round position that was established. And we were able to, as I said, nominate our own representatives. So we had a bit of a democratic process that the working group developed. And that was, yeah, really wonderful. I mean, since then, the Canadian delegation has grown to include, so that civil society liaison, 2 other elected representatives from the working group, so that's 3 people, then 2 representatives of youth, which also attend the youth forum, so that brings us to 5, then 2 representatives of people who use drugs, so 7, and then also most recently at the last session of the CND, we added 1 Indigenous people's representative, so a total of 8 civil society spots. And that's also does not include the 1 long-standing spot that's for the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, which some consider civil society, but others do not. It's an organization created by the Canadian Parliament. So it's kind of questionable in some people's views whether that counts as civil society. I mean, they were longstanding on the delegation, even under the Conservative government. So I wouldn't say that was a marked change. But yeah, I mean, one of the benefit, right? Like, why does it matter to be on the delegation? It really allows for close and sustained collaboration with government colleagues and during the CND, before, after, and you get to provide input on like their statements, their negotiation positions. You also get access to government-only spaces at the CND. So these things called informal meetings, which, for example, around resolution negotiations, before resolutions go to the committee of the whole, they're negotiated just between member states in these closed meetings that civil society don't have access to. So when you're on the delegation, you have access to those spaces. And maybe just, I mean, one other thing that I would add is that what I've talked about so far is the main sessions of the CND, right? Like the CND that happens in March. And there are other CND meetings that happen. There's intersessional meetings that happen. There's a reconvene meeting that happens in December every year. And the working group had really been trying to get representation in those spaces too. And the COVID pandemic allowed that because all of a sudden everything was virtual. So for example, there were some meetings, the topical meetings around the WHO's, the World Health Organization's cannabis rescheduling recommendations in 2020. And those were the first ones. I actually was at the second and third topical meetings on the delegation. And those also were relevant to the intersessional meeting and reconvene that happened that year. But we were also able to push that further. Like instead of just having 1 rep, which was me at those meetings, we were able to push the government to have 2 representatives at the later meetings in 2020. And that's really important, right? Again, you can like provide input to these meetings where previously had no civil society input from Canada's side. And again, just like active year-round kind of collaboration. I mean, it hasn't always been linear. Like the gains that we've made in previous years have not always been maintained in subsequent years. And we can talk more about that if that's of interest. But overall, the trend has definitely been expanded civil society representation and opportunities for input, which is really like a marked difference, right? From when I first started engaging at the CN through Canada.
I'm just wondering, how do these like informal sessions like look like government only rooms? Like, do you have like special like drinks there or something?
No, there's no snacks or drinks. And in fact, often they go on for hours and hours. So you're pretty much dying for drinks and snacks by the end. But I mean, it looks like the cow insofar, the committee of the whole, insofar as there is a projected Microsoft Word document on the wall, and they're using track changes. It's not all the member states in the room. Not all are able to attend informals. Some have smaller delegations. So when informals are running in tandem, they can only be in one space at one time. The virtual format, I think, has allowed, because now informals, of course, happen on the computer online. So it's allowed more member state representation. And in a lot of ways, they look like a cow in that everyone is there, all the member states are there, but other types of representatives are not. But yeah, it's just them going line by line through resolution text, because of course, we should say that CND resolutions and all outputs are negotiated by consensus. So that means you're like getting to the lowest common denominator, right? What can everyone agree to? So it's often vague and means one thing to one person and another thing to someone else. So yeah, it's literally just going line by line. And sometimes it's really like dry. Like it's like, oh, the words the should be added, or like grammatical corrections and things like that. But also there is a whole underbelly, right? It might seem dry, but like there are these political motivations, like small word changes mean substantial things or are linked to other issues. And yeah, so I think the more exposure you have to it too, like what seems kind of boring or like, yeah, just like really slow moving, you see is actually, yeah, it has a lot of other context under it that you learn over time.
Yeah, definitely. I know I've seen that a lot of debates at the UN and the Commission on Narcotic Drugs specifically have been yeah, can seem very much n- not hopeful in a way, like they don't give you much hope in terms of progress, because sometimes they're just reduced to, oh, should we acknowledge that some populations are marginalized? Well, I don't know, maybe not. Maybe not this year, next year potentially, but it's not in the UN language, I guess. So yeah, there's a lot of back and fro when it comes to the UN. And yeah, I was wondering if you have anything to add to what Nazlee said around, how the Canadian delegation sort of gets involved with the UN, and how sort of your collaboration with that evolved over time.
Yeah, I'm happy to just talk about like what that experience like looked like for me to
Mhm.
kind of illustrate some of like the points that Naslee's made about like what civil society engagement looks like, and kind of illustrate, so if other people are trying to do something similar, like what
Yeah.
that looked like for me, help them kind of like relate or see how that goes. Like I do think I had a leg up in that I had already been to UNGAS. So when it came to like the self-nomination of being like I should be on the delegation, it's like I have previous UN experience, because I think going in without any background, it is like a whole different world in the UN. It's like it's the language, it's got people speak their own languages, like the social etiquette is so particular. And there are definitely like differences as well in terms of like engaging at the UN level, going to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs as a civil society member versus as someone on the delegation. If you're there like as a CSO, just a civil society, you have more free reign in terms of like engagement and like how you're carrying yourself. But when you're there on on a delegation, you typically are like, you have to sign like an a non-disclosure agreement about like not sharing sensitive information, like the way you're carrying yourself and what you're sharing isn't necessarily like representative of your views. It's more so like representative of your country's views. So it's interesting as like a radical drug policy activist, like in Canada, who normally is like pushing my government to do better, to be at the UN and be like, actually we're good, this is great, this is these are our policies, and like they are actually pretty good. But I guess that's just more so in terms of like the level and like the background. In terms of how I actually got on the delegation, like I had been, as I mentioned, already doing some engagement on like the international policy level. I'm part of the civil society officer working group that Nazlee mentioned on drug policy and like UN issues. So I had been engaged with that for a while. And then when it came time to, nominate the people to put forward, the other thing too is like, and I think like Nas can speak to this as well, like the process of carving out that space and how much it changes like from year to year as well. Because I think initially there was like one youth delegate, but then the year that I went, like the way the prime minister, like the PM has like a youth advisory council, and I think typically like it's a bit like that's like where he would go to pick like youth representatives. But because I was involved in like this at the civil society level in drug policy, he ended up picking someone from the youth committee that he has, as well as a youth civil society member and a youth who uses drugs. That was also part of my cell, is like I am a person with lived experience and I'm a young person. So I think it's really important to have this represented at the commission and in the youth forum, because I think I might have also suggested like that we put the youth into the youth forum, like because it's like, okay, we have youth on the delegation, but like what's the deal with the forum? Like let's go check it out. Like I'm pretty sure I just asked, and then they were like, yeah, like let's do it. Like you like really like an ask goes a long way, like to self-nominate, to ask, and then all of a sudden I'm at the UN essentially. And yeah, it's interesting as well. I think like things that are of advantage is like obviously having a bit like a network around you and like already being kind of known to your government by having engaged prior, as well as just like having strong networks in like the NGO drug policy space in your country is super helpful. As well as like being really familiar with your country's policies. Like I'm fortunate that generally like I'm well aligned with my country's policies as much as I am pushing them to do better. I feel like representing your country at the UN, if you really disagree with your government, would be horrible. Almost like it would be very difficult, because you're here to uphold the policies that they're advocating for.
Mhm.
And similarly in the youth forum, most of the youth being put forward are people that are there to further the agenda of the country that is putting them forward. So if you're a country that is like very anti-drug use, if you're like a country that thinks that drug users should all be dead, then you're going to send a youth forward who will be there to talk about the scourge of drugs in their community and how much it's like destroying everything. Versus like going for Canada, I was there to talk about the impacts of stigma on young people who use drugs drugs and like the benefits of harm reduction and why youth need harm reduction services and that young people do drugs. And like, I was probably the only young person in the room who was like, I do drugs. And then, because I mean, that could get you killed in some countries. I'm also like a queer and trans, which is a whole other thing. So I'm like, I don't got much to lose. Like, what do I have to lose here? But yeah, so just kind of asking for it, pushing yourself, putting it forward. But even so, like I said, even if you can't get on the delegation or into the youth forum, just being there to network with the other youth that are in attendance is of huge value. So I don't know, that's what I would say.
Yeah. I mean, if I can just add to, maybe I should have said in my introduction that I've had the opportunity to go to the CND now, the main session of the CND, to be clear, that March session 9 times. And while 4 of those were with the government of Canada, 5 of those were with civil society. And it is absolutely totally a different experience. Like, you are constrained when you go as government. But I wanted to say, like, when you go as civil society, I remember the first year that I went in 2014, just even trying to do that was like, I remember telling my mom about like, oh, this like thing exists at the UN, the CND. And she was like, oh, like, could you go? And I was like, hell no. Can I swear on this podcast? I was like, hell no. There's like no way that I can get through the door. I'm like, this is like for people who like know what they're doing. They've been in the space for like such a long time. And it blew my mind that like I was able, like just a few months later, to actually be there at the UN in Vienna. And it was through, I mean, CSSDP doesn't, and at the time, of course, didn't have ECOSOC accreditation, so economic committee and social council status with the UN, which is required to gain access to these spaces. So like, we talked to our friendly civil society partners in our country, and that was, at the time, they were called the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network, now the HIV Legal Network, and they gave us passes. So like, if you want to get into those halls, there may be ECOSOC accredited organizations in the youth international space, but also in like your domestic civil society that aligns with you, maybe other reform organizations, harm reduction organizations. And often they don't use all of their passes. So they're very happy to, if you're aligned and they know you, and, or, you know, you just have a recommendation for someone, you send them an email to give you access to that space. And then all of a sudden you're there, which to me was like quite a shock the first time.
Yeah, I imagine. And sometimes like it's so hard to hear that from you, because well, when I came into like the drug policy space, like, of course I came like 9 years after you basically, and it's so hard to imagine that the people that are so well experienced and seem to know everything, and you actually go for guidance, were actually in the same sort of position as you. They didn't know what was happening, and they found it a very intimidating place. So yeah, I think it's also reassuring, I guess, in terms of the kind of potential that I guess each young person has to actually become those experts, and like that nobody actually expects you to know everything from the start, and that UN ultimately is a place of learning. So I sort of think, going from there, I know that, you know, youth participation at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs and the United Nations in general tends to be limited, sometimes tokenistic, and not that common when it comes to the actual hard decisions that need to be made in those forums. So I was sort of wondering, and I know you guys touched upon this already in multiple ways, but I was thinking, do you think there is anything else apart from what you said, or are there any points that you want to reiterate when it comes to, you know, just advising people that might be looking, that might be hopeful, might be thinking or dreaming about just involving with the UN and being in those spaces and trying to really uplift the youth voices there? Do you have any sort of advice on how they can get in touch with their country delegations, how they can be on a country delegation, or how they should start participating in general? Do you think they should start as part of a country delegation, or maybe they should try with civil society if they can?
Do you mind if I start on the why and then you can add on the how? Because I feel like that's like a good point, because I, like, as someone who's done like the UN policy work, it's like, I think easy to feel like, why bother, or like, what's the point of these like massive bureaucratic systems trying to engage in this like high level policy where it's like extremely slow incremental change. But just like, the reality is, like, in a lot of drug policy spaces, like the UN isn't much different in that like youth are central to the conversation and largely absent from the conversation. It's always like, think of the children, protect the youth. Like, this is like such a huge theme recurring constantly in drug policy conversations, is like protecting young people. and yet there are not young people present, and the way they're engaged is extremely limited. So it's like to have young people actually show up to these spaces and say like, and to be able to advocate for themselves and their own needs, because like you can, use youth as a pawn in your drug policy, in your prohibitive attitudes around drugs or whatever you're trying to do. But like if young people show up and are like, these policies are harming me, or like this is the change that I want to see, then it like there's so much power in that, in being a young person and saying like, this is what I think and these are how I'm being affected. I just think that's like that youth hold a lot of power in those spaces, even if they're not always afforded. I think that's why. It's because they're scared of the leverage that young people have in these spaces, just as like incentive for like why people should go and be there. But I'll hand it off to Naz to talk a little bit more if you have anything to add, but also on the like how to get involved piece. I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to give some like kind of practical like strategies for how to engage. And I think first, just to say, I mean, we talked about gaining access through civil society, like reaching out to ECOSOC accredited orgs in your organization, in your country. But there's also international ones like International Drug Policy Consortium that aims to kind of organize empty passes, if you will, of their member organizations that others might be able to use. So definitely look into those. But if you are kind of aiming to get into a government delegation, your government delegation, presumably, there are some strategies for like building and strengthening your relationships, right, with those government colleagues, even before you get on the delegation, like in the years preceding, so you can build your exposure. They know who you are, you've developed some experience, and you're well positioned to kind of seamlessly transition into a delegation spot for civil society and for youth civil society if and when that's opened up. So I mean, I think a main one is like having these regular meetings and communications with your government before, during, after the CND. And it's really important, I think, to be coordinating with your other domestic NGOs. I mean, that's why we have the working group that I talked about in Canada. This idea of like singing from the same song sheet, right? Like, what are the key advocacy issues at the CND, but also domestic issues that you want to raise in those conversations? Also with international NGOs, like I just mentioned, IDPC, it's a really great opportunity to kind of build your network and understand what key global issues are that might not be particularly relevant to your specific country, but that should be raised by your country in that forum to lend their voice to these issues that are affecting other countries. And maybe one practical tip I'll give as part of that is like, if you don't know who is representing your government, there is a list of participants that the CND publishes every year. It's on the UNODC website per section, and you can go and you can Command F, you can find your country, and you can see the list of government folks that were there. And those change year to year, but they're, at least the most recent one, you can start there and start doing some outreach and being like, these are the people I want to find their emails for. Or maybe if you have a government colleague, you can ask them to connect you to those people or whoever might be relevant this year. Because sometimes people don't know like who to contact, who is it in this government, this kind of vague space. There isn't a lot of transparency around. So yeah, I think definitely like engaging with your government. Also, I mean, the working group, we produce an annual policy brief. This is also part of like the singing from the same song sheet, but this idea of like having like your asks written down, referenced, like be able to give that to your government. And that's something too, that there's something called written submissions that NGOs, ECOSOC accredited NGOs, or again, if you partner with an ECOSOC accredited NGO, can submit to the UNODC. And then those get posted like on the UNODC website for all member states. So we would take our Canadian policy brief and we would like tweak it so that it was tailored for all member states. And then that would get published. And we also even do like post CND reports for Canada. And those are really important to like, again, keep that conversation going. So it's not just that one touch point in the year. Although that report is more about like, typically has been more about process, like how can we improve our engagement with them? And then I think like, you want to make yourself really useful to your government colleagues, like you be an asset to them, a resource for them, because it is a really fast-paced kind of environment with the CND, like things like negotiations with other member states, right? If you can share what's called previously agreed language, like language that member states have already negotiated and agreed to, that's often more acceptable than new language in a consensus-based negotiation environment, right? So like the CND app that IDPC runs, that's a great kind of database that you can use, and you can look up like, oh, they're looking for a term for social marginalization. What language has been used before? What resolutions can we refer to? And then you give that to your delegation or you provide that to them, and all of a sudden you're useful, right? Even the CND blog has like records, I think it's 11 years now of past CND. So like you can when countries speak under this agenda item. I know this year I was really happy. I was on the delegation this year and I was able to push Canada to make a statement under the Sustainable Development Goals agenda item, which is something they had done previously, or when they done so, it wasn't actually about SDGs. So it was so awesome. And that was something I was able to look at the history on the CND blog and really push them to do. So, those type of suggestions sometimes do get taken up. Side events are another obvious perhaps mechanism that you can use. I know SSDP did a really great side event at the CND this year and Canada co-sponsored that one. So it's really wonderful to be able to get that collaboration. All of a sudden you have an in, you've sponsored a side event with them before, you're building that relationship, even inviting them to make remarks. And now that side events are hybrid, right? I know that there's Canadian government people that aren't on the delegation, but that go to select side events that are relevant to their profile. So it's a place to see governments attending. You can, record your side events and use those over time. Again, that's something you need ECOSOC accreditation for or to partner with, but many NGOs are very happy to partner. I mean, the CDPE does not have ECOSOC accreditation, and we've hosted side events for years and years, always with different partners. So yeah, maybe just one other one I'll share, because I am the chair of New York NGO Committee on Drugs, is to join the New York NGO Committee on Drugs if you have a civil society org in your country that isn't already a member. There's also the Vienna NGO Committee on Drugs. These are the two kind of umbrella organization, umbrella meaning there's members that are covered by this umbrella org. And yeah, it's a really great way to stay informed of civil society opportunities, for statements, right? In the plenary, that's something that for the CND statements, the VNGOC has jurisdiction there and selects who is speaking under each agenda item for civil society. Again, something that you need ECOSOC accreditation for or to partner with, but that's another really great way to have exposure, literally make a statement at the UN about your key priorities. So yeah, I would encourage folks to join those committees too and stay informed of different opportunities as they come up.
Yeah, I'll actually, could I add one thing quickly?
Go ahead,
to Naz's point, or specifically around what added value civil society members and youth particularly might bring to a delegation is also recognizing that often the government reps that are composing these delegations might not be drug policy experts. They might be global affairs, they might be secure, so often if you have a niche thing that a lot about drug policy, whether it's psychedelics, whether it's cannabis regulations, whether it's STBBI and HIV or any of these things, that can be of huge value, especially if there has been one of the amendments that has been proposed by a country is relevant or overlaps with your knowledge area. As someone on the delegation is CSO, youth, or even has lived experience of drug use, can really inform, and the government will perhaps look to you and say more about this than we do,
Totally.
and ask for your opinion. So,
and they get swapped out all the time.
Yeah.
The CND people are not the same year to year. In most cases, I have been to far more CNDs than anybody that's on the government delegation. So you if you are focused, if the UN is of interest to you, which is when I entered the drug space, the UN piece was my key interest, you will quickly gather more experience than many of the representatives on the government delegations. So all of a sudden you're the expert after just 4 CNDs, 3 CNDs, you've been to more. Most of them have been to maybe 1, maybe 2, not that many.
Yeah. Oh, and then one other piece that I wanted to add to on the getting to CND thing, and it might be different now that things are mostly hybrid because of the pandemic. I know that in previous years, we've also crowdsourced funds to send members because we're in Canada. Getting to Vienna is not easy. So if you get on the delegation, then the government will obviously pay for you to get there. But if you're just going as civil society, sometimes you have to crowdsource funds to get people there. But it's something that it's often a way to generate funding as well, as to be we're trying to send someone to CND. This is important. Give us your money, please. So I don't know. There's that too.
Definitely. I think it's also, international youth organizations such as Students for Sensible Drug Policy and Youth Rise. I think there are also good places to start, especially for, young people that don't have a lot of connections with governments or haven't actually interacted with the civil society spaces. I definitely was in that position, and I just came and served the drug policy space without knowing anyone in the UK that did that work. And I sort of through SSDP, I managed to also grow my network. And what we try to do a lot of the times when we have young people that, come from different countries that don't necessarily have access to their governments or to other civil society organizations there, we always try to use our networks again with IDPC, because I guess we're all connected and we are an international family. And if you know one, you can get to know the others. And yeah, you get an amazing network of people that are well connected with government officials. And in many times, I think we've had young people interested, and we managed to get them on delegation meetings and uh, connect them with government officials in their own country. And that has happened through our UN training series this year, and also efforts were very much so. Anyone that is sort of interested in the UN, I think if you go through to a youth-led organization, they're really, really determined and motivated to help you get there and build your connections and your skills to be able to enter those spaces, because we realize that they're quite inaccessible in a way, but also not as hard to break into as we might think. Yes, Sarah.
Yeah, I really love your point, Heath, about like you said, like self-nominate and just ask. Like if you just ask, it might happen actually. Um, yeah, and just kind of if I could summarize, I loved some of your points, Nazlee, as well. Like, so UN is a place of learning, and then yeah, just some advice about how to kind of build a relationship with your delegation to kind of yeah, establish that relationship of trust, and then ultimately join the delegation. It's having regular meetings with the delegation, so knowing what's going on, what's the language, what are the positions, and then knowing who's the representative in your government. One other thing I wanted to ask, I mean, CND, so the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, that happens every year in Vienna. Not all countries are a part of the CND, right? So how does that work? And also, I guess in relation to that, how common, you were talking about the civil society working group that you have in Canada, as well as kind of the international civil society group that is the IDPC. How common is that in countries? Because you know, we know that Canada is super advanced in reform of drug policy, but not all countries are. And so I just want to kind of see if we can map out what are the countries maybe where we can make the most impact and work in that direction.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I'll start with the first question. Yeah, you're right. Like the CND technically is a subset of member states. I think it's 53 member states compose the CND, and they serve 4-year terms, so they change occasionally. But the key thing to remember too is that while the actual CND members, they are the pieces that they are able to do that other member states are not able to do is, for example, voting on scheduling recommendations. So new drugs that the WHO or the INCB, International Narcotics Control Board, recommends for scheduling, they actually do the voting, which is kind of the only voting, except this year there was some more voting that happened for the first time at the CND this past session. But typically that's the only time voting happens. They also can table resolutions as like the lead person on a lead member state on a resolution. But all member states participate in the negotiations. They all make statements at the CND. They all are represented and are like, there isn't a massive difference in my view between like CND member and non-CND member in terms of member states with what actually happens on the ground at the CND. They're engaged, and yeah. So the other question you asked too about like the working group, I mean, the only one that comes to mind for me is that there is kind of an EU mechanism, and I don't know the exact name of it by memory, but it's like a civil society kind of body within the EU that kind of informs them and provides input. But I know that they have not been successful in getting on their delegation. So, you know, there's different barriers in different mechanisms, but I don't know of any other kind of sustained and active and yeah, like one that has had as much success maybe than Canada's in terms of like getting recognized and building that relationship. And of course, you know, we had a political opportunity. So it's not by lack of trying for civil society, like you need that receptive government to actually make inroads, right? But yeah, like I know the US, for example, consults with civil society, but it's in no way like an organized mechanism that meets regularly on its own and has its own like priorities and puts those forward. So I don't know, Heath, if you're aware of any others or have any other thoughts on like CND member versus non-member and what that looks like.
Well, no, I think the piece that I think more about is like the civil society engagement and like having civil society and just like non-government people like represented on delegations, and how it just seems like something that makes sense to do. I like, once again, I guess like it depends like how much like the general like populace is aligned with their country's like drug policies or the policies that are being discussed. But I feel like there are definitely like progressive countries that would benefit hugely, and like there would be a way to sell them on that through making yourself of use, through like making the case about like why it's valuable. But I think the only other like missing piece, because I think Nazlee summarized it all really well, is just like recognizing also like what it is to be civil society or like a person who uses drugs in an environment like that, and that it can be hard because you're just like listening to people talk about how people who use drugs should just die, and you're just like, I'm right here, like I'm like, you're talking like, it's weird to be in a space like that, and it can be really trying and like exhausting and just like depressing frankly. But like, I don't know, like I know our government has done a lot to ensure that like the people who use drugs that they're bringing to these spaces feel adequately supported by having exactly like two people who use drugs, two youth, so you're not like the only person who's like here alone in like this big space. I don't know, that's I guess like one of the only other things that I would really add to the piece about civil society engagement and like representation at the UN. But Naz, what are you thinking?
I remembered that definitely Australia is quite organized in terms of a working group of civil society there that engage quite well. And I think, Heath, you already mentioned perhaps that Australia has some representation on their delegation, but if not, that is a thing that they do have civil society on their delegation. And it's not quite the same. Like, I don't know that they nominate their own reps or anything like that, but certainly they're an organized kind of group. So if you're in Australia, or if you have contacts and connections with organizations in Australia, that seems to be somewhere where there's already inroads that you can take advantage of. But I mean, if I can just add to what Heath said, like, yeah, for sure. I remember like my first few CNDs just being like, what is it? Like the types of language that is used, there's so much variance. I'm thinking particularly of like statements, right? Because those are not consensus based. Governments stand up and say whatever they want about their own country and what they're doing. And some of the things they say are really, really awful, and it's really hard to hear. And even Canada, like in those first couple of years, I mean, you know, they weren't praising the death penalty for drug offenses. So it does get worse. If anything, it gives you perspective on where your country falls in line with like the global kind of spectrum of perspectives on drugs. But those first couple of years were hard to hear from Canada. It was all supply reduction. It was all like law enforcement. And the first year that the Liberals were in power, I like wept like a baby. It was like tears of joy, just like such a contrast to how they'd spoken in previous years. So some serious whiplash like happening there. And, you know, since then we've continued to like make them say positive things or push them to say even better things year by year. But yeah, I mean, don't lose hope. You know, the political winds can change, and the civil society voice is so critical in like pushing for that improvement.
Yeah, and it's definitely like, as it was for us, like a foot in the door, and then you just like keep pushing and like don't stop pushing, because that's how it goes from one civil society, like one youth, one person who uses drugs, to getting like indigenous perspectives or like any other like so much potential value that could be added. So
yeah, from
Awesome.
0 to 8, it's a huge improvement.
Yeah,
Excellent.
that sounds amazing and challenging at the same time. There is a lot to be done, but I think from your stories, like I think there's also a lot of hope, and I do hope that your perspectives kind of helped demystify the place in a way and help people realize that it's not as difficult as it appears to get in those spaces and eventually build those relationships. And I guess as civil society gains more ground at the United Nations, we actually manage to set our governments towards actually being more involved and actually giving them a voice. I think just being there in those high level meetings just kind of helps elevate our voices and just places importance on them. So sort of in line with this, so I was wondering if you guys had any final thoughts on, you know, any sort of final advice to young people that are contemplating doing something around international drug policy and getting involved with those processes. What advice do you guys have for them?
Ness, do you want to go first, or should I take it
Sure.
first?
Yeah, maybe I can start us off and then you can close us out, Heath. I mean, I think one other practical suggestion I would give, I think it's really underused in our drug policy reform movement. And it's also something that's lower barrier. It doesn't require ECOSOC accreditation. So literally any like organization can do this. It's around engaging with UN human rights mechanisms to raise drug policy issues. So actually really recently CSSDP and my organization CDPE, along with HIV Legal Network, which I name dropped earlier as one of the great allies in getting us passes to be in the door, we made a submission to the Committee on the Rights of a Child, which is the kind of body that monitors implementation on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And this was in advance of Canada's kind of upcoming dialogue. So we raised things like decriminalization, legal regulation, harm reduction, and drug education. We talked about the disproportionate representation of Indigenous and Black youth in our criminal justice system, all this in our submission. And it's at least, at a minimum, it's a way to sensitize these UN human rights compliance bodies to drug policy issues, because often drug policy is so siloed in the UN. Like the CND is the main policymaking body, but we all know that drugs are not just about drugs, right? They're about everything: human rights, peace and security, development, health. Like they intersect with all the pillars of the UN. So I think this exercise of like de-siloing and making sure that the whole system is actually reinforcing it, that drug policy isn't undermining the other goals of the UN, is really important. So these other kind of ways that you can engage that are maybe outside the CND are, in my view, just as important. So at minimum, you're sensitizing them to these issues and you're raising these issues. But in the best case, you're making your member state engage with the UN in this way on drug matters if the committee actually raises it in their questions and all of that. So we've also submitted to the Human Rights Committee, the Committee Against Tortures, and there's also like call for inputs from the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Even the Special Rapporteur on Health, like they often put out calls that may not just be about drugs. Like the High Commissioner one would be on law enforcement and racism. Well, we know that's relevant to drugs, right? So you can write a whole thematic submission around drugs and Canada there, even if it's a general call. So yeah, I think it's a really kind of low barrier way for me to engage and to make sure that we're making the system look at drug policy issues.
Nazlee, is this a way to kind of sue countries for the drug war that they're waging? Because I've been thinking, especially like last couple of years that I've been kind of away from the UN, I've been kind of, thinking about it in different ways. And one of the things that I'm thinking about is, someone needs to be sued for what is happening. I mean, there's so many victims, so many people have had horrible things happen to them because of drug policy, not because of drugs, but because of drug policy. And like, how are we going to sue? Like, who can we sue, and in what court, in what instance can we seek justice for this? Is this the instance where we would?
I mean, I think these mechanisms are more for applying maybe political pressure through UN bodies on your government to take action on some of the ways where they're falling short on human rights when it comes to drugs. Unfortunately, a lot of human rights law, it's not binding in the way that other laws are. There isn't like enforcement mechanisms in the same way. So I think, yeah, it's, if anything, and not all countries respond to political pressure or care about political pressure. But if anything, it's like getting it on their radar, getting them to push for it at higher levels in the UN, taking it to be maybe a priority of the Secretary General, like hoping to kind of broaden the focus on drugs beyond just that piece. And I totally agree with you too, like the drug war has caused more harm than drugs. I'm actually wearing my Transform shirt, which says prohibition causing more harm than drugs since 1961, which is the year of the first UN, like the single convention, the cornerstone of the drug control regime. So yeah, I mean, ways to go with that. But the mechanisms I mentioned are more just monitoring compliance and trying to position the governments to take better action.
Yeah, I feel like it definitely like familiarizing yourself with like the mechanisms and the language so that you can leverage it against, or like, you got to talk the talk to be able to like make your case. And it's interesting, Sarah, even what you say, like about how like, the human rights abuses of the war on drugs, like, is that not enough to get someone kicked out of like a member state, booted, or like something must be going wrong there? But no, it was when Canada legalized cannabis that we were threatened to be kicked out of the commission because we were breaking international law, because we legalized cannabis and not because we're like out here conducting human rights abuses or anything. It's fine. I feel no type of way about it. But Yeah, I definitely think familiarizing yourself with the mechanisms, with the language, and like even as I said too, like the sustainable development goals and like the Commission on the Rights of the Child, like these other like things like that bad drug policy, prohibition, for example, like so clearly go against like so many like there's writings on like the ways that prohibition and like the national drug policy situation as it is directly conflicts with the sustainable development goals, like as well as like so many points to be made about the ways that our current drug policies globally like are, you know, not aligned with like the rights of children around the world or something. But it's about like learning the language to make the case and like the way that they do. And then I think the only other thing that I would add to that is like recognizing the different like what different like activism and advocacy looks like at different scales and different levels, like, and how big it is. Because like a lot of what I've done with CSSDP is like local grassroots organizing, like in my school, in my city, like, or in my province, where it's like you can get stuff done really fast. It's like, oh, people keep overdosing, so we're going to do a pop-up like overdose prevention site and like hand out naloxone or Narcan, or we're going to do drug checking at the festival. Like when it's like small grassroots, you're like, we can just do it. Like you ask for forgiveness, not permission, is what they say with like small local like efforts like that. But the UN is the opposite. Like you ask permission, you are lucky if a change happens in 5 years. It's just so much slower. So for me, it's been like always a balance of like doing both. Like I've heard it say like a foot in the boardroom, a foot on the ground, like where it's like, because if I was just doing UN policy engagement, I think I would become so exhausted in like, I have so much respect for people who are at the CND every year, because I feel like I do it once and then I'm like depleted for 2 years and I have to like disengage from the global like political system for a bit to like get my energy back up. But that a lot of where the energy comes from isn't from like the closed meetings at the CND. It's like the paradigma or the SSDP or like the CSO parties that are happening, where like you're learning about like how passionate people are in different countries and like why they're passionate about what they're passionate about, and like how they're doing what they're doing, and all of that. And that really is like where I think the energy to sustain that work at like that high level comes from. It's from the networks and the people and the activism that really keeps it going. But yeah, that's what I would say.
Maybe I'll just clarify one thing too about like, I mean, I shouldn't say that human rights law isn't binding. It's more that states are sovereign and they have their own kind of jurisdiction over their own place and how they do things in their own place and justify things in their own borders. But there is, I mean, the one thing that came to mind after I responded to Sarah was that, of course, the International Criminal Court looked into the Philippine situation around drug war killings. So like there are, I mean, that is, I guess, the one mechanism within the UN where you can kind of trial, you know, people like that for war crimes. So it's not, it's not off the table, but you know, that's a very extreme situation. Whereas I'm sure we would argue that other things beyond extrajudicial killings should be things that people are sued over in terms of drug war harms. But yeah, that's one to flag in case people are interested in looking into it more.
Yeah, definitely. Honestly, this is all really useful information, and I guess can be a bit overwhelming. I'm imagining our listeners are a bit also excited, but also kind of overwhelmed with the amount of information that we shared in the last, half an hour. Well, is it more than half an hour? I guess maybe more, probably. But yeah, thank you so much, guys. This is going to be the end of our episode for today. It's not going to be the end of our UN series. We're going to continue bringing new insights from young people that have been in those spaces and that can unpack and hopefully make the spaces more accessible to the people that are really grounded in the communities that are affected by the war on drugs. Thank you so much and see you soon. Thank you, Nazlee. Thank you, Heath, for this.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Bye.